I've watched the Death Note movie 8 times. It's not a good movie, in fact it's a pretty bad one, but something about it keeps drawing me back. Maybe it's the tiny glimmers of gold in an ocean of garbage. Maybe it's the excellent opportunity that was unfortunately squandered. Maybe it's just the concept of a high-budget live-action adaptation of an animated show that was already a high-budget adaptation of a graphic novel. Whatever the reason, I have a feeling I'll never be compelled to watch it ever again. Because after 26 years and nearly 1,100 chapters, the One Piece live-action adaptation is real. And unlike the Death Note movie, it's actually good. Okay, maybe it's not great, but it's at least a solid 7 out of 10. And more importantly, it's very promising. If it does end up getting renewed for another season or 8, there is no doubt in my mind that it'll become much better. I was cautiously optimistic about it from the first trailer, which incidentally had me grinning from ear to ear, and now that it's been released, I'd like to take a look at the changes that were made in Adaptation, because they run the gamut from really clever to necessary downgrades to objectively worse. If you want the in-depth background on One Piece, the first video in my mini-series is all about the history and context of the manga, so go watch that. In regard to the Netflix show, it was greenlit after a personal endorsement from series creator Eiichiro Oda, and the first season released on August 31st, 2023. It was overseen by Matt Owens and Stephen Maeda, with input from Oda. The episodes were written by Owens, Maeda, Ian Stokes, Damani Johnson, Tiffany Greschler, Tom Hindeman, Laura Jackman, Diego Gutierrez, Alison Weintraub, and Lindsay Gelfland, and directed by Mark Jobst, Emma Sullivan, Tim Southam, and Joseph Lodkia. It stars Iñaki Godoy as Luffy, Makinyu as Zoro, Emily Rudd as Nami, Jacob Romero-Gibson as Usopp, Taz Skylar as Sanji, and The Going Merry as itself. It follows the beginnings of the Straw Hats' adventures, covering the majority of the East Blue Saga with the omission of the Island of Rare Animals and ending before Logtown. There are, of course, the myriad changes that come with any adaptation, but the 8 episodes in the first season are largely a retelling of the events from the manga. Let's work chronologically through the major changes to the story, then afterwards we can examine the holistic experience. Instead of an extended childhood sequence with Luffy meeting Shanks, we start with Luffy in his dinghy, explaining his dream to a news crew. Starting with Luffy as a child works fine in the manga, where the pacing is dramatically slower, but it would kill the momentum of the show, and limit how much ground the first episode could reasonably cover. Additionally, starting with the childhood actor Colton Osorio for Luffy as an introduction would be pretty underwhelming compared to the high-energy bombast of Iñaki Godoy. Next we have Alvida, who has been made significantly more threatening, and her emphasis on beauty has thankfully been changed to fearsomeness. I do kind of miss seeing her island hideout and having Kobe really stand up to her, but ultimately cutting that to keep the pacing tight is probably for the best. At Shellstown, we have a slew of changes, the biggest of which is the early introduction of Nami. I feel pretty mixed about this, honestly. On the one hand, introducing Nami here lets the map to the Grand Line become the proper central focus of the season, and her infiltration of the Marine base is definitely a fun sequence. On the other hand, introducing her at the same time as Zoro kind of undercuts the fact that he's Luffy's first crewman, and dampens the power of their relationship. Speaking of Zoro, I like that he gets arrested for beating up some Marines at the bar in what's an amazingly choreographed fight scene, and then disrespecting Captain Morgan, instead of getting arrested for killing Helmeppo's dogs. But I don't love that he basically ends up sticking around with Luffy and Nami for no reason. It is very funny that Zoro cuts Helmeppo's hair though, implying that when Helmeppo shows back up at Water 7, it's not a change in hairstyle but a return to form. Side note, Helmeppo's arc is one of my favorite parts of the show because of how well Aiden Scott fluctuates from petulant to genuine and back. Moving on to Orange Town, we get the best joke in the series when Nami says there's only one type of pirate, immediately followed by the reveal of Buggy's circus crew. And Buggy is simply perfect. I have no complaints, and any praise I could give would undersell his magnificence. I love the lampshading of Richie the Lion, I love the way the nose joke is adapted, and while I miss Chocho's expanded role, I will take his absence for Buggy's continued appearance throughout the season every day of the week. Conversely, Syrup Village is a bit of a mixed bag. Jacob Romero-Gibson is great as Usopp, and deflanderizing him is a very welcome change. The other positives are Kaya being actively poisoned by Kuro instead of just being afflicted by a case of being a wayfish damsel, and the scene where Luffy, Zoro, and Nami get dressed up for dinner is simple but excellent. There are a bunch of largely inoffensive minor changes to the arc, but some of the bigger ones are less than stellar. I don't inherently mind Django being cut, but it means Usopp doesn't have much to do at the climax of his introductory arc, and that's pretty disappointing. The emphasis on what it means to be a real pirate and the contrast between Kuro and Usopp is basically absent, which removes a big part of the thematic core of the arc. And then we have the really bad change. The tension of Syrup Village is maintained by Luffy and Zoro being absent for the first part of the final act. This wasn't handled super well in the manga, but instead of improving on it, the show makes it worse. Luffy is taken out of commission by eating a full pot of poisoned soup, which knocks him out for a while that causes him to barf. In the manga, Luffy is largely immune to poison, but that only happens after he's nearly killed by the myriad poisons conjured by Magellan's devil fruit and his subsequent healing by Ivankov's hormone injection. In the show, I guess he just has a ridiculously powerful immune system. Zoro somehow gets it even worse because he's banished to the bottom of a well and only gets out by the power of flashbacks to his backstory. In my perfect world, we would have gotten his full backstory in Shellstown when Luffy meets up with him after popping into the military base. But really putting it anywhere other than what should be Usopp's moment would be better. Between Syrup Village and Baratie, we get my personal least favorite change the show made, the handling of Garp and the Marines. My biggest complaint might seem kind of silly, but it did legitimately disappoint me quite a bit. Garp looks, sounds, and acts nothing like Luffy, when the crux of their relationship is the striking similarities contrasted with being on opposite sides of the law. I get not wanting to make it too obvious that they're related, but since that's revealed halfway through Season 1 instead of at the end of what would be Season 4 by following the manga, I feel like that shouldn't really matter. I have no problem with Garp, Kobe, and Helmeppo getting more screen time early on, but then chasing Luffy through what is canonically established as the tamest of the four seas really hurts the overwhelming power of Garp. If Garp, a legendary marine who went toe-to-toe with Gold Roger multiple times and has a particularly strong sense of justice, is just kicking it in the East Blue while letting Morgan and Nezumi abuse their power, Buggy destroy and occupy towns, and Arlong casually terrorize half the population of the entire area for over a decade, that makes him either extremely unobservant and ineffective, or implies that he genuinely cares more about testing his grandson's resolve than doing the job he dedicated his life to and wanted said grandson to also dedicate his life to. In terms of sheer number of changes, Baratie probably comes out on top, but none of them are all that bad. Much like Usopp, Sanji has been made much more endearing via deflanderization, and the demotion of Don Krieg from arc villain to jobber opens up space for Mihawk to become a greater focus. And that is definitely worth it, because Stephen Ward kills the role, and Zoro's duel with Mihawk has always been a favorite of mine. It also gives the entire series some room to breathe, and lets Nami really establish a friendship with the rest of the crew, making her betrayal and their standing by her much more affecting. The break in the action also gives time for Luffy and Sanji to bond, and while Sanji joining the crew is a little too abrupt for my taste, I love the addition of Zeph's quitting is staying here line. And finally, we have Arlong Park, the most polarized arc of the show. It had some of the best moments of the season, but also blunts the raw emotional power of Nami's character that makes for the perfect climax to the first leg of the Straw Hats' journey. Starting with the bad, Nojiko, and by extension the rest of Cocoa Village, no longer knows about Nami's plan to save them. Nami's backstory is about community and found family. She, Nojiko, and Bellmare aren't related, but Nami and Nojiko are very much Bellmare's daughters. Nojiko gets her tattoos specifically to make Nami feel less alone, and the rest of the villagers treat Nami like a pariah so that she wouldn't feel guilty if she decided to just run away one day. The turning point for every resident of Cocoa Village is the betrayal of Nami, someone they consider their own. They take up arms and march to certain death because they're tight-knit and care about each individual member of the island. But in the show, Nojiko has tattoos just because, and Cocoa Village decides to attack Arlong after their town is destroyed, and it's just happenstance that it coincides with Arlong's betrayal of Nami. But the march on Arlong Park is perfect. Usopp wins his fight through planned trickery instead of trying to avoid the fight entirely and only attacking out of shame, and Luffy doesn't get stuck at the bottom of the ocean for most of the sequence. All in all, the live-action show nails the characters and almost always makes the vital scenes work splendidly. It captures the spirit of freedom, the dichotomy of Luffy's brand of piracy with the oppression that the villains all cultivate, and the camaraderie of the Straw Hat Pirates. It recreates some of the iconic scenes from the manga without falling into the trap of trying to simply replicate the story as closely as possible. It is, by any metric, a good adaptation of the source material, even if it isn't quite as good as the original. And that's what actually matters at the end of the day. Trying to surpass the source material is an excellent goal, but it pales in comparison to translating the essence to a new medium. There will always be a part of me that thinks adaptation is a waste of time. Why should you take something crafted to fit one medium and try to cram it into another, when you could just work from the ground up on something new? But that sort of misses the point. An adaptation can refocus what it's adapting. It can emphasize some of the things that the original was less suited to portray, and sometimes it turns out that the story actually works better in the new medium than the old. The other way to look at it is that an adaptation introduces something to a new audience it would otherwise never reach, but I'm the kind of art snob who thinks that anyone who abstains from certain mediums isn't living a full life. I've watched the Death Note movie at least once a year since it came out because it fascinated me. I've watched the One Piece show 3 times since it came out less than a week ago because it makes me happy. The fact that it fascinates me is just a bonus. The One Piece show is an example of the utility of adaptation, and for all my small issues with it, I dearly hope it gets more seasons. Because if their first attempt was this impressive while covering a section of the story that I consider good but not spectacular, I can't even imagine how much I'll cherish what they can do with more experience in arcs like Water 7, Marineford, or Wano.
Don't give it up, Luffy! Don't give it up, Zoro! Don't give it up, Nami! Don't give it up, give it up, give it up, give it up, give it up! Here's how the story goes, we find out by the treasure in the Grand Line, there's no doubt. The pirate whose eye is on it, he'll sing, I'll be king of the pirates, I'm gonna be king.